What's up, everyone? Happy Tuesday. We are at episode 5 of the People-First Playbook. For those who celebrate Thanksgiving, happy Thanksgiving week. We're excited to have a few days off at the end of this week. And for those that don't know me, my name is Nick Bennett. I am one of the co-founders over at TAC, and we are talking about strategies for revenue-driven community building today. And so honestly, for those that don't know the show or maybe are listening for the first time, shout out, I'm streaming on all of my social channels right now. This whole People First Playbook is all about strategies that are submitted by other people wanting to build a campaign. We build a live integrated revenue campaign or ideas for growth within 30 minutes. We did 30 minutes last week. Hopefully we could do 30 minutes this week. And honestly, it's great. The goal is to do it on a shoestring budget because let's be honest, the economy sucks. Who knows when it's going to get better? And we're all of us are marketers. We're all in the same situation where we need to do more with less. So if you have any questions, submit them in the chat. If we have time at the end, we'll get to them. If not, we'll send you a message after. But Andy, let's get into the campaign intro and background.
Well, hang on. I have a question that I don't want to submit via chat. What is your favorite Thanksgiving side dish?
You know, it's funny because I was actually I was at dinner with Mark last night, and we had a few others that we were doing like 2024 planning. We had an offsite, and we had a dinner at this really nice place, and he also asked that question, and I ordered a steak. I ordered a filet last night, and they put it on so like just hot, like mountains of mashed potatoes. And I love mashed potatoes. That's probably honestly my favorite thing to eat. But I also love apple pie. And I had the debate last night of apple pie versus pumpkin pie. And I hate pumpkin pie. I will not eat it.
Yeah,
but
same.
I love a warm apple pie with some vanilla bean ice cream on top. Like nothing better. How about yourself?
So my mother-in-law and my wife make these homemade potato rolls that we just basically chuck across the table at each other. They are amazing. So those are absolutely my favorite sides. No doubt.
Love that.
All right. So back to today's episode, right? So we are talking about ZoomInfo as our feature brand today. Stephanie Pinnell reached out. She's the director of event marketing over there. And the concept for today's episode is about community, because the campaign, an initiative that Stephanie's got going on over there, is how does ZoomInfo build out their community efforts while increasing the market's knowledge on what ZoomInfo fully has to offer across its entire suite. And I think all of us know the brand name ZoomInfo, but I personally don't think I have a great grasp about everything it does. And the reason why I say that is historically, I've worked with clients where, the SDRs, the sales team, they latch onto ZoomInfo because they need to create account lists. They need to create a database that they're going to use in outbound efforts. Or maybe there's an ABM component where they are creating something that they're going to go to market for. And on my side, I have explored ZoomInfo for, intent data and maybe some use cases there. And I feel like it's very sales heavy as far as what the market knows and understands around what this offering and suite ultimately entails. I mean, what about you, Nick? What's your perception there?
So I also, that's always what I thought of it as. I didn't know this actually till this morning, but I've been trying to use Never Bounce for ABM emails. I didn't know ZoomInfo actually owned them, because when I went to their website today, it was like Never Bounce by ZoomInfo. Again, I don't know. I didn't know that, but like as a marketer that has done ABM, and like honestly, you should be running your contacts through Never Bounce, just especially with all the email and crap that's coming out in February or whatever. I mean, there's so much. I mean, again, I've always thought of it as like an intent tool to be able to get emails and addresses and all that stuff. But I mean, I've never really kind of looked beyond like, hey, like I need to use ZoomInfo for this. For me, I'm not in sales per se. So like for me, it doesn't really matter. But like after talking, and I know Steph pretty well now, and I mean, I was amazed at how much is actually part of that suite. So,
and I think that kind of segues then into kind of the challenge that this campaign revolves around, right? It's that perception and assumption that it is a sales focused platform and suite of tools. And it's so much more than that. And when you think about community, right? Yes, ZoomInfo is a brand, it's a product that can appeal to so many different facets of things. But how do you carve out those niches based off of those use cases that rally around the centralized theme and brand, but create a relevant experience that somebody's able to latch onto and build from? Um,
Absolutely. So let's talk about the challenge for today of like, ideally launching something from scratch when it comes to the community and making sure it's a success, both with the true forum as like a home base and through social advocacy, because I think that's like very, very challenging in today's world, especially when there's lots of competition out there. And the ask specifically from Steph was, how do we build our community efforts in a way that allows us to have some wins in Q4? Again, I respect that, but all while building the longer play, which is community first, community led. Andy, obviously, people first means we start with the people. So let's dive into like the audience here.
Yeah, and when Steph reached out, she mentioned that it's a wide range of an audience here, right? Customers and non-customers that are predominantly members of revenue generating teams, sales, marketing, rev ops, enablement, etc. And typically those that work directly with ZoomInfo, I should say, are directors and above. There's some senior managers wrapped into there, and obviously you have SDRs and those that live underneath those decision makers. But this goes back to the point that I was mentioning before. When we think about audience and we think about community, we can't go to market with a community and expect everybody to latch onto it if we approach it in a very generic manner. We need to think about, okay, we have this audience and we know that this community can engage and entertain them, but how do we carve out aspects of a community experience that appeals to each of those? Because each of those different revenue generating teams and team members are going to have different passion points. There's different reasons for them to want to belong to something, especially when we also kind of layer on top of that customers who know and hopefully love ZoomInfo, and those that have the perceptions that you and I have out there in the market that are skewed.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's interesting because I did just see this like take over my like LinkedIn last week, or yeah, it was last week, where they had all like their like customers, or a lot of their customers on like Times Square billboards in New York. And I thought that was like super interesting because I was like, hey, I recognize these people from like LinkedIn. Plus I saw that they just did at the F1 race in Las Vegas, they had a really cool like billboard, and like think about, I mean, obviously all the celebrities, the amount of people that were there, super cool. So again, I agree. I think that there's ways to think about this that go way beyond sales. There's the enablement side, there's the marketing. Like you just have to think about like how this is going to be for revenue teams, revenue driving teams, go to market teams. And so I think like when I think about the problem that we're solving for this audience, it's more so that we want to be able to achieve these things and think about it as an ecosystem play. And so like, you know, there's a ZoomInfo kind of community right now, but there's a way to build and activate existing members. There's an education component of it. There's a strategy that supports implementation that drives not only the online component, which is really, really big, but let's be honest, there's a huge in-person component of it too. So ecosystem, which again, people first, like that's Mark and I, like that's our whole mindset. It's like you have all the go-to-market pieces within this people first mindset, but the overarching theme ties back to going to market with people, like the ecosystem, the partnerships.
Yeah, and I think as we start to think about, well, when we historically on this show have talked about triggering events, we've approached triggering events to the capacity of, okay, what's going to trigger me as a customer or consumer to look for the end product or service or offering that our featured brand is bringing to the table. This one's a little bit unique in the fact that what's my triggering event, not so much for ZoomInfo, but what's my triggering event for finding a community that ZoomInfo is hopefully building to supports my problems, my pains, my needs, my wants, and my desires. Because in my mind, when we think about the different team members of those revenue generating, business units, I'm going to have a very different passion and pain point, most likely in sales, than I will in marketing. So, what are the things that are going to make me latch on to, hey, I want to be the best salesperson out there? Maybe I want to nail my quotas. Maybe I want to, rack up the commissions, right? My own personal ambitions that out there. And my triggering events is, okay, well, what are the areas of opportunity that are going to allow me to do that? And on the marketing side of things, well, we are hit with different targets, we're hit with different quotas. We have our own different ambitions here that are tied to revenue. And where am I going to go to find those? And that's kind of the opportunity that exists here then too for ZoomInfo is how do you create a community that appeals to each of those different interests, needs, wants, and desires. But that's the triggering event for me is like, where am I going to go find this information? Because there's so much noise out there. I mean, you and I scroll through our LinkedIn feeds every day, and it's like blah 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 blah. It's the Charlie Brown teacher just all echoing off the walls every single time.
100%. Well, and that's like another thing. It's like for me, again, like I think the sales driven triggering events obviously makes a ton of sense. But like I think there's a huge like undervalued piece here, and it's like the ABM component of it. And I think like that could be obviously I mean, if you talk to every marketing leader, CEO, founder out there, everyone thinks they should be going all in on ABM and like, we got to go do direct mail. We got to go email these people with useless, unpersonalized things. But like, there's better ways to do it using intent. And there's, ways to be able to take databases for outbound purposes specifically. So I think, why don't we dive into some of the strategies for revenue generating community building?
Yeah. So you as the community guy, the first point of discussion I want to bring up here is it's one thing to build a community. It's another thing to sustain it. So I would love to kind of get your input and opinion here over your tenure of years, right?
Yeah.
Maybe lean on Club PF as an example here, but how do you approach those two different things, in a strategic way?
It's funny because Mark and I were doing our 2024 offsite planning yesterday, and a big piece of it was like Club PF because we saw a ton of success with it early on, and it's plateaued a little bit. It's like, how do you sustain it? How do you 10x engagement? How do you 10x membership growth? How do you 10x revenue from like a monetization standpoint? How do you 10x like the advocacy behind it? And so those are like all questions that we're trying to figure out right now that it goes into sustaining it. And I mean, we're fortunate where we brought someone on board to help us get to that point because again, it's a bandwidth thing. If you don't have the resources and if you don't have the capabilities to be able to grow it is one thing. Like, yeah, like Mark and I could grow it, but like it's at a point now where it's a lot of like one-to-one combat to be able to continue to get these people to evangelize on your behalf, which is again what I think like ZoomInfo really needs to do is like lean on that one-to-one side of it. I think that will get us to kind of like that next pillar point there, but it's like, hey, you have to use your resources in a smart way. And again, if your strengths or weaknesses are a certain area, sometimes you need to kind of get off of that and like realize, hey, who can help you get to that point? And sustaining is very different than originally building. Because you can sustain something. I mean, some people just get lucky. They catch a wave. Think about like all these like communities from like, the pandemic. They caught a huge wave, but are they sustaining it, 3 years later or so? I'd argue that some of them are struggling hard. And obviously there's some that are still, going out there, but it goes into membership tiers and what's the value for the members? Is there a strategic narrative and positioning that you can use? So those are kind of just some of the things I think of when I think of like building versus sustaining.
So for that initial build phase for ZoomInfo, do you feel like it's more important to go after customers before non-customers? I mean, it's kind of a leading question there, but go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, I definitely think so for sure. It's like you have to kind of analyze their current, like the current ZoomInfo customer. What's the target persona behaviors, the needs, the preferences, because that's going to guide the community building efforts. It's going to establish a unique POV for them. And the only way to do this is to conduct research and produce an analysis of those results. And when you think about it, it's like, I know we're going to get into kind of like measurement, because I think that's another big piece of it. But I mean, I built the initial community at Cleary years ago. And it was very much like, I was like, oh, let's just go after prospects and customers. But after doing a lot of research, a lot of conversations, it made way more sense to go down the customer path first, establish that best practices, map it all out before even going down the prospect side, because that can get super messy. And if you don't have the right people that are ambassadors on your behalf, it can get really tough, and things can get out of control quick.
Well, I also feel like the customer first mindset here also, it allows you to not stray too far away from talking about ZoomInfo, right? You still want to focus on them as people and their pains and needs and things like that. Don't get me wrong, but like when you're developing content then and the unique POV and unique value that you're creating within the community, it's probably a little bit easier because it's only 1 degree separation versus a non-customer where you don't want it to be feeling like a pitch or a sell in anything that you put out there. Like Club PF is a good example here in your master classes, because you're delivering value because you're allowing the members to be better marketers and demand gen people and everything else. And I think the same mindset can be applied here, where customers are going to give you the insight as to what they're dealing with as people, which then you can then extrapolate into the perspective ICPs, the niches that you have to be playing in with the different ZoomInfo, marketing versus sales OSs, right? And it allows you to create not just a flywheel of referrals and word of mouth membership growth, hopefully, but it creates a flywheel of content development and content strategy that is the value add that's going to ultimately scale the community.
100%. And I mean, I think of like, again, like the whole concept of this show is like integrated revenue campaigns. It's like, how can you create an integrated revenue campaign that's focused on community? I think it's really 3 things. If you think about it, it's you need to build the integrated revenue campaigns that align to events and community programs, because that's going to drive both new and expansion pipeline. I know we'll get into metrics and all that stuff, but just some high level stuff here. Second piece is you have to identify the themes. And again, if you're a marketer that's not using themes, or your company's not using themes, like whether you do it on a quarterly basis, first half, second half, whatever, like there's got to be big rocks. There's got to be themes that you have. So identify those themes for the campaigns that brings ZoomInfo's POV and their core positioning into the minds of the right buyers and customers. Hugely important. The third piece is, how do you create a plan for targeted programs for each campaign that really focus on the community building and the engagement for specific audiences? Because if I'm a salesperson versus a marketer, we're going to care about different things. If I'm a founder versus an IC, again, very different things. So all of that engagement, all of that, like, it has to be tailored. And again, going back to the overall theme, there has to be sub themes that fall below it, but tie into the end goal, which is really like everything needs to be focused around community led.
Would you consider putting paid media behind membership growth for a community?
It's funny. I actually, I talked about that yesterday. We haven't done that yet. I don't know. Well, I mean, if your focus is customers, I don't think I would say that's even worth it. I mean, I guess
I'm talking about scaling. When you want to start scaling outside of customers.
Yeah, I mean, I could see that, but it's like, again, if you don't have a clear delineation of like what the outcome of like the value perception that you're trying to drive, you're going to be wasting money, at least in my mind. Again, so lots of people build communities without any strategy in place. So I think it could be a channel to explore depending on how much you're like, again, are they joining this community just from an awareness perspective? Are you hopefully obviously going to grow that into new pipeline? I think there's a few things to kind of see, but if your primary KPI is increase engagement and followers, like it might not be a bad idea, but personally, I would probably, instead of using that, use my money to partner with like creators, influencers, and have like evangelists, contributors, like help them create a wave of engagement on specific days or weeks or whatever to drive that engagement and follower count up.
So I think paid media, and this is just thinking out loud, because the next flip of the script here is like, how do you sustain the community? And I think the through line here with paid as a tactic is, how do you take advantage of FOMO and distribute that feeling through paid media? Right. So like events, things that are going to sustain engagement and entertainment within the community should inherently be used as outward facing snackables and other distribution content that, hey, if I'm not part of this community, but I'm seeing this stuff out there, I'm hearing people talk about, what the hell? Why am I not part of this? And that fear of missing out is like the through line of not just sustaining the existing membership, but growing it and scaling it at the same time.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. 100%. Well, and it's like, how can you even, I agree with like those snackables, because again, like think about like all of the events that you're doing, both from a virtual, maybe in person component. Like you could create like a lot of short clips that drive like that FOMO component of it. I mean, we do it for Club PF as well. It's like, I mean, we need to do a better job for sure, but it's like we see a lot of membership growth. I mean, it's marginal at best, but like we see membership growth that comes in when we post specific clips of masterclasses. And I mean, Colin's done a fantastic job of reaching out to every single member, getting a very detailed kind of like readout of everything. And one of the biggest things that people say they join for is those masterclasses. Now we do have ways that we're going to make these even better in 2024. But people love to learn from them. And it's a lot of times things that like they may know the overall arching theme, but they don't know the details because it's, again, the audience is very different. And some of these kind of topics are things that maybe they haven't thought about before.
See, I think this is, as we start to transition here and we talk about measurement, like you alluded to, I think, the outward facing distribution of snackables and events and things like that also starts to create that through line of integrated revenue campaigns, right? Where you're not relying on everybody participating in the community just to be the sole revenue generating source, but all of the creation that comes from that community and outward facing conversations, right? I mean, you and I are both part of Peak. We're a couple of other ones where, there's a camaraderie that's built and there's a flywheel of referrals and word of mouth that comes out of that too. And if you add on top the content and the distribution of that content as well, now you're creating an integrated revenue campaign that exists outside of community and bleeds throughout all of your operational campaigns as well.
Exactly. And I mean, as big as they are, like that would be fantastic, I'm sure. But again, I mean, who knows? Maybe there's silos within the organization that like I mean, it's how do you overcome them, which going into the next piece, it's like, how do you measure success? So like diving into some of these KPIs and like leading indicators, lagging indicators. I mean, Andy, I would love to know your thoughts here, but I feel like one of the big things is that both I've looked at for Club PF as well as previous communities that I've built is growth in overall community engagement between ICP prospects, customers. But I mean, what have you seen, or what would you recommend for someone?
You have to avoid falling into the trap of measuring communities solely by revenue, because to your point, there's leading indicators, there's lagging indicators, and any C-suiter that sees you throwing up, oh, well, I'm going to be asking, well, we started this community 6 months ago. What has it done for the business? Well, it's done this, this, and this. You do have to tie it back to revenue, but you can't measure yourself solely on revenue, right? You have to look at, okay, I created this thing. What's our membership like? Not just in raw numbers, but what is the active total participation out of that membership? If I'm only actively engaging, or only 10% of the membership is actively engaging, I consider that a failure. I'm sorry. I just don't see it as a successful community at that point, because you're not creating any motion, right? So the other thing there is, when we think about quality over quantity, well, what is the quality of our membership? To your point before, Nick, like who's our ICP, and are those members of the community? Same thing with our customer base. So if our total customer base, right, the TAM of customers is, 50,000, well, how many of our customers are members as well, right? How do we slice and keep going to gain a greater market share of our customers' minds and hearts? And then same thing with like our employees. How are we actively engaging our employees and creating advocacy within the community that we're building and sustaining?
Yes, 100%. Yeah, I mean, but I mean, and I'm a huge believer of all of those things, which kind of funnels into like the next piece, which is like, how do you improve the ZoomInfo sentiment? Because ultimately, I think like if you can build a solid community that, again, we talked about the trap, how, ideas for building and scaling, sustaining sentiment should go up. Ideally, I mean, you have like one of the most brilliant minds of Henry, who's the CEO of the company, Brian, who's the CMO. Like it's a fantastic team that is really, really smart at what they do. And if you could pull this off successfully, and again, maybe tie Henry into it and like others, it's like that sentiment and like what people believe and see from like ZoomInfo and like how they kind of come across in the market is only going to go up. I see no way, if you do this correctly, that it falls backwards.
And then that sentiment leads into more opportunities for value adds through events, right? AMAs, getting the ZoomInfo name and understanding of the full offering out there internally within the community, but externally is more important at that point through that flywheel of word of mouth, referrals, external content distribution. Because then now you're starting to connect the dots to this lagging indicator KPIs of how many meetings are you getting booked, right? Demos. And then ultimately, as you progress down that road, well, what's the pipeline being created? What are the opportunities, all the sales stages, things? And you're connecting the dots outside of just community metrics, but using the community as a gateway to driving revenue.
100%. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm a huge believer of that. So I think like, I mean, I don't even know if there's anything that I would add from like lagging or leading indicator standpoint. I think all those are fantastic. And if I had to kind of like wrap this up from kind of like a recap perspective, I think it's like, listen, there's a difference between building and sustaining a community, and like having that strategy that ties back to the overall theme is incredibly important. The other kind of piece there, or takeaway that I would say, is like measurement. And again, we talked about like the revenue component, but it's like, how can we increase engagement and followers? How can we increase engagement and improve sentiment? How can we ultimately increase the quality of engagement and improve the sentiment as well? And so I think, obviously there's a bunch of things that fall under that, but ZoomInfo has a big enough team that I think they could support this. And I think that they could see a lot of success to not only continue to build this community, but continue to see revenue across their entire marketing organization that funnels a community-led growth approach.
Nick is passionate about something when he starts banging the table as he's talking. Like, da-da-da-da. The last takeaway that I'm going to throw in here is like, give a compelling reason for somebody to join. Create value. Because if there's no value, there's no reason for me to join as a potential member. There's certainly no reason for me to pay as a membership if it's a paid premium subscription. And then without value constantly being given and generated for me, there's no reason for me to remain a member. And those three kind of things always comes back to value. And then with that value that's being generated, the outward facing of it is just going to inherently drive revenue for you.
100%. Love that. Let's wrap things up. Look at that. This 2 weeks in a row, we've actually made it on time. I feel like we're getting better at this.
Somewhat.
I guess you can't get any worse. But again, thank you everyone for spending your time with us. We're very, very appreciative of that. If you have a campaign that you want to be shown on the show, reach out to Andy and I. Visit dragon360.com/people-first-playbook. Our next episode is set for next Tuesday, the 28th at 12 p.m. Eastern. And listen, we want to get better at this. We're no pros. We're trying to figure it out as we go. I feel like we're getting better every week. We're 5 episodes in now. If you have questions, comments, feedback, reach out to myself, Andy on LinkedIn. We're nice people. We won't hurt you. But until next time, Andy, have a fantastic Thanksgiving. I'll miss you, and we'll catch you all next week.
You guys too. See ya.